everybody, welcome back to another YouTube video. I hope you're all okay. I know that the world is kind of feeling like a heavy place at the minute, and because of that I thought it might be quite nice to recommend some books that I use to cheer myself up and make me feel better about the world and escape into, and that is romance books. So today I'm going to do a comprehensive guide to romance as a genre. If you're a long-time romance reader or a new romance reader, there'll be something for you in this video. I'm going to go through all the subgenres of romance, give you recommendations, places to start if you're new, go through some of my auto-buy authors and other authors that you can turn to if you want recommendations that feel similar to popular book authors. Okay, so let's start by talking about the genres of romance and what you can expect to find in all of them. The most obvious kind of romance that you're probably used to seeing on tables in your local bookstores is contemporary romance, and often these also tie into women's fiction. You might find Emily Henry, Addie Jimenez and other authors like that, or if you're a long-time reader you might remember authors like Sophie Kinsella. In a contemporary romance, usually the formula is two main characters, a meet cute quite early on in the book, sometimes single narration, sometimes dual narration, and usually it has a happily ever after. That's kind of the key basis. Some of them also have spy scenes, but some can also be what is known as closed door. Within contemporary romance you also have subgenres, and there are tons of them. Cowboy romance, sports romance, erotica. Then we have a separate genre to contemporary romance, dark romance. Now this is the one that you often see on Book Talk where people get quite judgmental of it. There will be no judgment here. I personally mostly read dark romance when I want a palate cleanser or I'm in a reading slump. It's not my go-to romance genre. In that, as the title goes, you can expect to see darker themes. The romance is not always healthy, it can be toxic, but that is often explored, and there is other exploration in there of types of romance, shall we say. Within dark romance you also have subgenres, the most popular probably being mafia romance. Then of course we have other romance genres. Historical romance, which you probably have heard of Bridgerton, that would be a very good example. Historical romance is basically what it says on the tin, a romance set in a different time period, whether it be Regency, Victorian, doesn't matter what it is, it's a historical romance, and the history has an important play in the story, and it's usually kept quite accurate to the time. Another popular one would be fantasy romance. Now some people get fantasy romance and romantic fantasy confused or think they're the same thing. The best way to think of it is the first word is the adjective. So if you were saying fantasy romance, you're describing a romance book that has a fantasy subplot. If it's romantic fantasy, it is a fantasy book with a romance subplot. Does that make sense? We also have gothic romance and paranormal romance. Gothic romance obviously being romance that has a gothic perspective or lens, whether that's in a fantasy element or a time period element. A lot of classic books have a gothic lens, but romance can have it too. A paranormal romance is exactly what it says on the tin. The love interest in a paranormal romance is usually going to be non-human. You might think of like Twilight as a paranormal romance because the actual fantasy plot is not very strong and it doesn't have very strong world building, but ultimately the love interest is a vampire. We also have LGBT plus romance, which is romance designed to cater to the LGBT audience and provide diverse representation. As well as genres of romance, there are tropes. Tropes are common plot devices that are used to market a book specifically. So when you look at the marketing of a book and it says a certain trope, you know roughly what you are getting yourself into. So common tropes might be enemies to lovers, friends to lovers, a workplace romance, a single parent romance. You might have a slow burn romance, an insta love romance. You might have a billionaire romance. There are so many different tropes. There are also terms in romance that we use to describe certain love interests or how a character's personality might be portrayed. For example, Black cat, golden retriever, you might have heard of that on like TikTok and stuff. Black cat is obviously a woman who is slightly edgier, not as extroverted, that kind of a thing, and golden retriever would be a male love interest who is extroverted, bubbly, warm, kind. Then you also have grumpy sunshine, and you can also get reverse grumpy sunshine as well. Grumpy sunshine is traditionally when you have a grumpy, alpha, brooding male love interest and a sunshiny, bubbly, extroverted girl, and then reversing that flips it so that the woman is the one who is more grumpy and kind of breaks those gender stereotypes. So all of this to say that there is so many different elements of romance. If you have never tried romance, or you've tried romance but you don't think it's for you, or there is only certain genres that you usually stick to, there is so much to delve into. I'm sure we're going to find you a romance rec today that you're going to love. If you are not new to romance and you would like some book recommendations, let's get into it. So I'm going to start by talking about probably the most current and successful author in romance, and that is Emily Henry. I have all of her books. I am a huge Emily Henry fan. I literally can't wait till her films are made. And they were actually the first romance books that I got into that turned me into a fan of the genre. I'd always been a young adult fantasy reader up until I read her. If you were going to start with Emily Henry, I would actually recommend choosing the book that has the theme you relate to most, rather than doing it in publication order or whichever sounds most interesting, because I think that is how you're going to get the most out of them. So for Beach Read, it is academic rivals to lovers, but the core theme is grief and family ties. If you've ever lost a loved one, this would be a great place to start. Then you have You and Me on Vacation, and this is Friends to Lovers. It also feels like a coming of age story in a way between these two friends. So if that's something you can relate to, I'd recommend this one. Book Lovers is kind of enemies to lovers, and it also deals with sisterhood and the feeling of being an eldest daughter and an older sister. So this is also a really good place to start. And this is the one that I read first that turned me into a romance fan. Happy Place is one of her more recent releases, and this has found family and second chance romance where they've already broken up and now they're working on their relationship again. And this is her most recent book, Funny Story. And this one deals with parental abandonment and also sort of being cheated on and things like that. It definitely has abandonment issues as a core theme. If you're interested in romance but you usually read fantasy, then you could go for fantasy romance. And a really great place to start would be the Ruthless Boys of the Zodiac series. The world building and the magic and the fantasy element of this story is super simple, and the romances are primarily the core focus of the books. It is multiple love interest, which in romance terms is often referred to as a why choose, where the female ends up with multiple partners who all know about each other and agree. This is also a prequel to the series Zodiac Academy, which is a more dark fantasy driven romantasy series that has bully romance, enemies to lovers, and is the perfect step up in terms of how much fantasy plot is added. Or if you are wanting to go into romance but you think you might like those darker themes, then I 10 out of 10 recommend the Sinners series by Sam Sketcher. These are mafia romance. Each book follows a different couple, but all of the couples and the relationships are interconnected. But if you are not new to romance, then let's get into my all-time favourite romance books across each of the genres, all of the tropes, and discover all the books that I think are personally worth your time. I've already talked about Emily Henry, so you know I love her, but another one of my favourite romance authors of all time is Ali Hazelwood. At present, there are 6 full-length completed Ali Hazelwood books. Then there are 3 novellas and a 7th book, which is in a new genre for her, is coming out. So with Ali's books, I would start with the first 3 that she published, and I would start with these in order, which is Love Hypothesis, Love on the Brain, and Love Theoretically. Again, these are standalones, but they have little character crossovers and things. That is the reason I think you should read them in order. They are contemporary romance in a STEM setting, so we often have themes of like science or work rivals or an office romance. They're in each of these. One of my favourite things about Ali is the humour that she includes, and you'll definitely get that in all of these, whether it be through pop culture references or actual banter between the characters. The Love Hypothesis was the first that she published, and this is based on Star Wars fan fiction. I'm sure he looks familiar to you. don't worry, you're not really going to get any of those vibes if you're not a fan of. All of these books do have explicit romance scenes in that make them not suitable for children. It's also something to be aware of if you're not into explicit romance scenes in general. I wouldn't say as an author she is the most explicit. There is usually about 1 or 2 romantic spy scenes in each of the books. But after those 3, you then have Not in Love, and she describes Not in Love as her first true erotica novel. And I would 100% agree. The 2 love interests actually meet through a planned date hookup, so the theme is there from the beginning. But she also says that this one has a more somber tone, and I also completely agree with that. If you need something more than romance and spice in your plot, you're still going to get that, because it deals with childhood neglect, food poverty and abandonment issues, and it is actually quite a sad book in places. This one actually made me cry. I love all of Ali's books, but I gave this one 5-star, and as it stands it is tied favourite with Love on the Brain. Then you have Bride, which is a paranormal romance. It deals with a vampire and a werewolf shifter who have been forged into a marriage of convenience to stop the war between their 2 species. Now, although this has vampires and werewolves, I wouldn't exactly say that it is a fantasy romance, because the fantasy element and the fantasy plot is very simple, very basic and quite small, and honestly a tiny bit flawed in places. So I would describe this as a paranormal romance. I have to say that this is my least favourite Ali, and I only gave it 3 stars. So would I personally recommend it as much as her other books? No, but there are tons of people who do love this one. I have to say that also the spice kicks up a notch in this, and it has some things that you wouldn't necessarily see in your sort of vanilla romantic scene. And then we have Check and Mate, which is her first and only young adult romance, and this is rivals to lovers. And this is a really fun, unique book about 2 chess players and the perfect entryway to romance, or for an established romance reader who isn't fussed about spice. Another one of my absolute all-time favourite romance authors is Elle Kennedy. Now, I have so many Elle Kennedy books that I cannot actually hold them all, so I have got the first from each of her connected series that I love. Elle Kennedy moves into a genre I talked about earlier, which is sports romance, but more specifically hockey romance. All of these are set at college with a Division 1 hockey team setting. Now, The Deal is the first ever sports romance book I read, and I think it probably is the best way to start. Again, if you need something more than just a love story and a happily ever after, this is a good place to start. Our main character Hannah has been SA'd in the past, and she is dealing with the fallout emotionally from that. She ends up tutoring our love interest, Garrett Graham, who is the typical sort of captain, arrogant hockey player, but what blossoms between them is deeper than just a flirtation, and it ends up helping her and him with some issues that the other might not have necessarily known that they had. There are 4 full-length books in this series, and they each follow a different member of the hockey team, and then you have a 5th book which is called The Legacy, and it's kind of like a extended epilogue in a way of all of their stories. After that series, you then have Briar You, which is a spin-off series, still college, still hockey, about their friends. The first book follows the sister of one of the love interests in the off-campus series. Each of those books, although each of them is hockey romance, they all have different tropes too. So one might be enemies to lovers, the next one's friends to lovers, the next one might have an accidental pregnancy. And so it's a really good place to start with romance, because you start to learn what it is you do like and what it is you don't like. This series is new. She's still in the process of writing them all, so it's incomplete. She's on the 3rd one, which comes out next month, which will be The Charlie Method. But as it stands at the moment, we have The Graham Effect and we have The Dixon Rule. These are next generation stories. So the first book follows the child of one of the couples in the off-campus series, and so on and so forth. Again, still college, still hockey, all that good stuff. Another absolute favourite sports romance of mine is The Wall of Winnipeg and Me by Mariana Zapata. This is a much different vibe to Elle Kennedy. The story is much thicker, it's longer, and it has the slowest slow burn ever. So if you are looking to just get spice scenes and exciting tension straight away, this is not that. You need to be in it for the long haul. It's about a Canadian football player who hires an assistant, and as she is working for him, he makes an unexpected proposal because he needs to secure a visa in order to continue playing for the Canadian team. It has the grumpiest love interest ever. It's the definition of the grumpy sunshine trope that I talked about earlier, and it's just one of my all-time favourite romance books, and definitely a sports romance worth reading. Another one of my absolute favourite book series that is sports romance is the Playing for Keeps series. I actually have a little note from the author up here. These have since been traditionally published, and you might recognise their beautiful landscape scenic painted covers now that are sort of like blues, purples and pinks, but these are the original indie published versions, which is why they look a little bit different. Again, these are hockey romance, and they are also interconnected standalones, meaning each book follows a different couple that is also seen in the original book. The first one is Consider Me, which is about a professional NHL level hockey player who is known as a playboy, you know, all of that vibe. He's always in the press. He's just got a bad reputation. The love interest is a teacher. She's very much normal, down to earth, completely different vibes. They end up meeting, and he really wants to make her his, but she's obviously doubtful because of his reputation. Now, the Playing for Keeps book series is not for everyone. They are long stories. The story does also continue past them falling in love. If you like the conclusion to be the great declaration and then they live happily ever after, that's not always the case. You might get an I love you 50% into the book. I can often see people describe these books as cringe as well. They definitely do have an element of cringe and cheesiness to them. I personally wouldn't describe myself as someone who likes cheesy or cringy things, but for some reason with these, for me personally, it just works because they are funny and light-hearted with it. It's not taking itself too seriously. These do have spice scenes, and they are very spicy. There are 4 books out at the moment, and the 4th book is my absolute favourite. I have to say the absolute best thing about these books is the found family and the banter that we get between all of the friendship groups. I really love small town romance and cowboy romance. I don't know why. I think it must just be because it's so far out of my norm as someone who lives in a capital city. But 2 of my absolute favourites within that genre are the Blue Rebel Ranch series, which is cowboy romance, and All Roads Lead Here, which is a small town romance. Blue Rebel Ranch follows a family that own a ranch, and again, each book is interconnected standalone, so you definitely want to read these in publication order. So you have Done and Dusted, then Swift and Saddled, then Lost and Lassoed, and then soon to be Wild and Wrangled. You will get seriously attached to all of the characters in this book series. They are all great. And one thing that Lila does really well with this book series is a mental health representation. In book 1, we have a strong ADHD storyline, which is own voices to the author. In book 2, Swift and Saddled, we have a major depressive disorder, and that is one of my favourite books ever because of the way that she writes that major depressive disorder storyline. Book 3 deals with grief and some other things, and obviously book 4 is not out yet. If you need your plot first and your romance second, I have a few different recommendations for you. The first would be 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This book is dual timeline, so it's split between the past and the present, and it shows 2 adults as they meet, and you as a reader realise they have a long-term history, and then it keeps flicking back to a time period of 7 days in June when they were younger, how they came to be and why they are no longer friends or together. It's a beautiful story. It has so much exploration of culture, of classism, racism, all different things. There is also chronic illness representation, and the female main character is a single parent. The same author, Tia Williams, also has a book called A Love Song for Ricki Wilde. If you've been thinking of delving into historical romance but you're not really sure if you're going to enjoy it, this is the perfect one to start with because it is actually set in modern day New York, but it explores the history of Harlem through the lens of another character, and it is really well done. If again you want plot first, romance second, but you want that plot to have a magical realism twist or a fantasy twist, I would recommend these 3 books. The first one is A Dowry of Blood. Now, this is such an unusual book for a lot of reasons, but one of them being it's written in second person POV. It's like she's writing a letter to one of the characters, which makes it really interesting. It's basically a Dracula's Brides retelling, so it has that gothic twist that makes a gothic romance. It also has a historical element, and it's also got diverse representation and polyamorous relationships. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches would be your next one. This is set in modern day Brighton, but it follows a woman who answers a classified ad for a witch, and she is a witch and she goes to be a nanny for 3 young budding witches. There is amazing found family in this, and again, really great diverse representation. It's such a fun, cozy read, perfect for that summer, autumn transitional time. And then you have what is probably classed as a romantic fantasy, because the fantasy plot is well developed and a core part of the story, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This is an absolutely brilliant best-selling book, and it is huge for a reason. Again, this has a historical element, it has a paranormal element, and it also has a modern period set in New York. So if you are new to any of those subgenres, this is the perfect place to start for you. Let's talk about some spicy fantasy romance books. Phantasma is a great one for you if you're not wanting a strong fantasy plot, but you do want action, you do want spice, and you do want magic. This kind of feels like the Saw movies in terms of deadly trials and challenges, but not as scary. You will get a ton of spice for this, and it's quite fast moving, so if you need a slow burn, perhaps not the book for you. Savage Lands is also a perfect book to start for people that either want to try a spicy fantasy romance or just want something a bit different that they've not read before. This is new adult dystopian fantasy romance. The fantasy plot is there in a dystopian world in Europe, but the romance is first and foremost the main part of the story, and it develops over 6 books. There's also a spin-off series. In fact, there are 3 spin-off series, so if you just can't get enough of this series, you've got plenty to sink your teeth into after. Another fantasy romance book that would be good to dip your toes into a fantasy storyline or go from fantasy to a fantasy romance would be The North Wind. Now, this has since been traditionally published, so you will find it with a different cover, but it is a standalone in a world that continues with interconnected standalones after, also known as an anthology series. This follows a girl named Wren who volunteers to go with the Frost King in sacrifice of place of her sister. It's Marriage of Convenience, it's a Beauty and the Beast and Persephone and Hades retelling, and it is quite a thick book, but because it's just one, again, the romance I would say is the primary focus and the fantasy second. One of my absolute favourite romance series of all time is Magnolia Parks. I guess that this would sit in the contemporary romance sector, but again, it almost leans into women's fiction a little bit, just because it doesn't follow your stereotypical plotline of a romance in terms of how they treat each other and a happily ever after. It is still an incomplete series, so we don't know if there is an actual happily ever after for all of the characters, but there is a happily ever after for one set of characters at the moment, if that is something that you need. Now, these books are a bit like if you crossed Gossip Girl with Made in Chelsea and Normal People by Sally Rooney. There's some very toxic characters. There's some plot lines where everything is not what it seems until much, much later in the book series. And there are some really hard-hitting themes in them too, like grief and loss. This is maybe one where you want to look up trigger warnings before you go into it, like you would with a dark romance series. But it has some of the most beautiful writing ever and some of my favourite characters ever, and you absolutely have to read them. Abby Jimenez is an absolute must read if, again, you like heavy plot with your romance. All of her books have some sort of theme, whether it be chronic illness, mental health, that makes it easy to relate to you in some way. My personal favourite is Yours Truly, but this is number 2 in an interconnected series. Starts with Part of Your World, then goes on to Just for the Summer. She also has other books that are interconnected, but you can find reading guides on Google on how to best read her work. But if you like Emily Henry or Ali Hazelwood, she is an absolute must read. And then I'm going to end with one final recommendation, which is Divine Rivals, because this one is young adult fantasy romance, and it also has a historical element. So if you like your romance with some old historical charm and a little twist of magic as well, this is perfect for you. It is a completed duology, and Rebecca Ross has some of the most stunning writing ever. And if you like yearning in a book, this is an absolute must read. But thanks so much for watching, guys, and coming back for another video. Please make sure to like, share and subscribe. Drop a comment below if you too are a romance lover. And if you'd like any more romance recommendations, then let me know, because as someone who read 75 romance books just last year, there's plenty where that came from. But I hope you have a lovely week and see you next Monday. Bye!